Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey.
Thank you, Ben, for being the leader for this book club.
I hope we are. I'm gonna check the YouTube link.
Looks like we're live.
Yeah, looks good. Cool.
So, how was everybody's week? Or 2 weeks? Good,
That was
bad?
good.
Sandy, did you get your book? Can we see it?
Oh, hang on. Sure. Hang on.
Very nice. Look at that.
Very new looking still.
Nice and
Although I
clean,
have
pages
written in it a little
unbent.
bit. Yeah. New. Yeah. Shiny still.
Did the people from
No,
the
it's not
library?
totally unbent. It has little bits of,
That's good.
Did people from the Canadian Library reach out to you? I asked somebody to.
Oh, no, I don't think so. By who? What means?
No, I'm kidding. It was just
Oh, good. Phew.
calling back the joke from 2 weeks ago. Did I have connection to the Canadian and the Canadian library system?
I
Exactly.
remembered you saying that. Yeah.
They're everywhere. I also thought it was pretty funny this week that Jacob's not here, and this entire chapter was about kind of in dialogue with Chabad Hasidim, and so I was like, how fortuitous is it that Jacob isn't here for the one chapter that's definitely needed Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you able to read all the pages, Ben? Did you catch up?
I did. I had to read some extra. Yeah, but I made sure to read everything. But yeah, I missed the ones that I missed 2 weeks ago were pretty interesting. So I'm glad I did that as well.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about anything from those two, feel free. Is there any jumping off point that anyone wants to start with? Sandy, you always have questions. Come on, Sandy.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna look in my notes. I was gonna say, as part of my sharing, that I actually came home from work yesterday 2 hours early. I kind of hit the wall. So I spent all of my time I was gonna spend this afternoon reviewing sleeping.
Sleeping.
So I did. On Tuesday, I went out and sat, and I did make some notes on pieces that interested me in the early pages. And I had intended to spend this afternoon actually going through there's two or three things that interest me. And one of the things is how much of the sections in here this week touch on Song of Songs, which Rabbi Malott is been studying for, I think it's 3 years or something, if you look on his website. And yeah, so I was hoping to listen to some more of that as well today, but yeah, that and the amount mathematics is spoken of. Those are some of the things that grabbed my attention.
Yeah. I can try to think. I think I came out when I was reading it, a lot of things that came up, in no particular order, but I think I got an interesting understanding, or let's see. I think definitely the fact that the Hasidic movement is also mentioned, Chabad specifically, kind of helped me as somebody within Judaism that doesn't really understand the modern Orthodox and the Hasidic, kind of like what are the differences there. And I went to Wikipedia, and it kind of tells you kind of like there's like more like specific differences there. But here you can see something about like how modern Orthodox or Soloveitchik, like the author, is really wary of mysticism in general. And so I can see how that's a big difference, or that's a big difference between modern Orthodox and Hasidic, the Hasidic movements. And I remember, like I have a friend who's like a modern Orthodox or observant Jew, and I think maybe a year ago I kind of like sat down with him and was like telling him that I was like interested in learning more about Judaism and stuff like that. And he was like, and I was telling him about what I'm interested in, and he was like, that sounds like more Hasidic. That like it doesn't sound like what I kind of like where I'm from, like what my background is. And I didn't really know. I didn't understand like what the difference. Like that was the first hint for me that there was like such a big difference. I don't know if you can call it philosophically between the two groups. So that was interesting.
For sure. And why do you think you're more interested in Hasidic or mystical thought as opposed to, or maybe not as opposed to the Halakhic Man? Why do you think you're more interested in mysticism?
Well, you can go about it in several ways, right? I mean, you can. I can say something about that's kind of like my personality. I've always been interested in. Well, I don't know if this connects somehow, but I mean, I've always been more open. Like I've done creative art, like I've done theater and writing and stuff like that. Filmmaking most of my life. So I think that's kind of like where I'm kind of those things, more lofty kind of ideas or abstract stuff, that stuff that I'm more interested in. Even in the work that I do today, it can be more technical. It's like software and it's in tech, so it could be more technical, but it's I'm much more like leaning towards like the problem solving or like the process and stuff like that. So so it's either that's how I connect to it, or I mean that's how so I guess that's kind of like part of it, how I would understand it.
Okay.
So just to and I apologize, I'm eating a candy. I'm gonna so the mystical is more in line with Chabad, or with rather than the Orthodox, or is Chabad Orthodox?
So it's more aligned with the Hasidic movement, or I'm not 100% knowledgeable about the terms, but I definitely I think for sure you can say when you talk about modern Orthodox, that's the version that the Halakhic Man talks about, or the Halakhic Man is really the foundation for the modern Orthodox, or part of the foundation for the modern Orthodox movement. So that's how they're very interlinked, as opposed to the Hasidic movement or Chabad specifically, which has a lot of those, which took a lot from Kabbalah, as well. So that's kind of how it's more connected to mysticism.
Thanks.
Yeah, and from what I hear too, that Chabad, Hasidim, their form of mysticism is a little bit more systematic than other types of mysticism. So
yeah, I don't know the difference too much between the groups, because the groups to me are like I didn't even know. It's kind of weird for me to even think that some of these Hasidic movements are more mystical, because it's so funny. Like I lived in Brooklyn, and is somebody that kind of like, and they seem so. I'll be slightly offensive, but just to get the point, they seem so insular. It seems like they're so kind of like, like there's no room for really anything creative. But apparently, they are more creative, or they're more mystical, even other than Chabad. Like there's other Hasidic, like Satmel and stuff like that, which they're very insular, like in Brooklyn. I don't know, maybe Jacob might have other thoughts about this, but you don't see the mysticism, you don't see the kind of like the creativeness or the love that they have, which is really interesting. I got a little hint of that. I'll just stop with this, because I might send you a link to that. And I think Jacob also said something about this. There is a series of videos of this guy, non-Jew, like Peter Santinelli or something, that goes in Brooklyn, and you see him talk to Chabad, but also to Satmar, which are more insular than Chabad for sure. And the guy there in Satmar is like, he talks about how the smell of the tzitzit, of the thing that he wears, reminds him, like gives him joy and reminds him of God. And it's like, it's really a lovely moment. And for me, it seems so, it kind of clashes with some of the stereotypes that I would have, even as like a Jewish, but I just don't know those communities. So
it's interesting. Because I mentioned about Song of Songs and seeing the references there. And I was thinking while I was reading last time, I think Jacob was talking to us about monasteries or monks or something. And so when you talk about insular, that image also comes up to mind, because I was talking about my son liking the Red Wall series and the gardens and all of those things. So there is somehow a link there to what you're describing. And I have far less idea on any of this than I'd even pretend to say I know. These are things that kind of catch my attention as I'm reading, and I'm like, that's interesting that that's the case. Yeah. I'd love that link too. Have a look.
Yeah, I think that's one of the probably pathologies of the religious man, the insularity. And I guess maybe that's what Soloveitchik, the author, is part of what he's pointing to, is that this can get you into this kind of insularity, right? Both just practically in terms of not being connected to the rest of the world, right? Because you're living in an ideal world that's outside of this world, right? You're living somewhere else. But also, and I think this is actually goes into another interesting thing in, I think I have it referenced in like page 58, that he talks about subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's connected, and I didn't think about it, about how, like I wrote a note about how it's lonely, it's lofty, and it's in your head. So it's fallible because you're not really verifying anything with the rest of the world. Like you're not taking the patterns and like making sure that they actually are manifest in the world. You're just in your head. So that was interesting.
Sure, and I think it also kind of has something to do with like the aspect of escape, right? Where I think the Rav mentions like the Shekhinah, how it's sad or it's painful to actually be in this world, right? And it desires to be like liberated from the world, where the Halakhic Man is like, no, the joy is like the union or like being with the Shekhinah in this world.
Mm-hmm.
So like insularity is an aspect of like trying to transcend or leave the world, right? Like in the actual physical. And it's reflective then in the mystical kind of approach of also trying to like transcend and leave reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what surprised me, because I always thought about, I think I like just by default kind of mapping cognitive man from the book to the modern man, and religious man to religious people, right? The religious man. But in a way, and I think when he talks about subjectivity, he talks about the religious man. The modern man is partly has some modern people have these the kind of the features of the cognitive man, but some of them would have the features of the religious man, even though they're completely secular. So that's why when I was thinking about any other, people that are, we talk a lot about it from like in a cultural context in the conversation, how people that are postmodern and thinking about like just getting their own values and thinking about all these things. And this is the problem with it, is that it's not, that it's not verifiable in a way, or it's not really communal, which really makes it very fallible, even from an existential point of view or practical point of view.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's that Bob Dylan song, "Everybody's Got to Serve Somebody." That's kind of like that, where and I think that this is something that like Paul Vervaeke, not sorry, Paul Vanderklay, I mix the two,
Yeah.
talks about, and it's something interesting, kind of with the philosophy of perception, where we kind of have this idea that like we're objective, but we're kind of like subjective, and at some point, I think Um, Vanderklay has like this picture of a table, and the question is like, what is real on the table? Like, is the table really just atoms? Is the table really like four legs and a flat top? Things like this, where I think, as you're saying, like, we all kind of have this aspect of religiosity where we have some sort of subjectivity, and when it clashes with the world, what do we do?
Mhm.
And can we even, maybe even another question is like, can we even have objectivity?
Objectivity. I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm thinking. Page 58 is interesting, where you're talking about that near the top of it, because I had a bit of a discussion on Tuesday with my ex, because I was trying to get his take on sort of the transition between where we ended off reading last time and where we started reading this time. Because I was looking at where we started at top of 49 in section 9, and it was talking about, how do you say it, symptom? How do you say that?
Symptom.
Symptom of like that contraction, that that really had my attention. But when I went to talk to him about it, I found myself going back a couple of pages and reviewing it from page 47.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my notes, I had written down from page 40, from, let's see, it's from reference 52 at the back, or it's where it references 52 at the back. What I started writing was simply the sentence, "Holiness is created by man, by flesh and blood."
Mm-hmm.
There from 47. Actually, I'll read it out of my note because it's bigger print. It says, through the power of our mouths, through verbal sanctification alone, we can create holy offerings. And sorry, I'm trying to keep the screen on the page where I can see you and hide this at the side. But took it to the back. I had made notes on of the note places, but I had not quite made it in my notes to where you were referencing on 58. But when I'm at the top of that page, and you were speaking about the subjectiveness up there as well, it's talking about taking hold of like the senses and things. And where did I see it there? So at the top of 58, it goes back to what I was grabbed by there. Where did he start that sentence? He must have started it on the bottom. Do we say psychic power? I'm not a philosophy student. Anyway, so on the bottom of 57 is where he starts that thing you're referencing. A subjective religiosity cannot endure. All those tendencies to transform the religious act into pure subjectivity negate all corporeality and all sensation in religious life, and admit man to a pure abstract world where there's neither eating nor drinking, but religious individuals sitting with their crowns on their heads, enjoying their own inner experiences, their own tempestuous heaven-storming spirits, their own hidden longings and mysterious yearnings, will in the end prove null and void. And then it says the psychic power of religion that seizes hold of man, that subjects and dominates him, is a force only when the religion is a concrete religion, a religion of the life of the senses, in which there is sight, smell, and touch. A religion which a man of flesh and blood can feel with all of his senses, sinews, and organs, with his entire being. A sensuous religion which cognitive man will encounter in a very palpable way wherever he may go. A subjective religiosity comprised of spiritual moods, emotions, affections, of outlooks and desires will never be blessed with success. And I find that really interesting that the section that we were reading this time, it has this whole concept of how we participate in it from a flesh and blood perspective, where we think we have to disengage with that completely to be really religious. But at the same time, when we do that, we actually put other things in place that make the whole thing worse. And I'm pondering that.
Wait, so when you say you said when we need to be religious, that turns. What do you mean when we need to be religious? Can you expand on that? At the end, you mentioned that.
It might just be because I might just say that because on the page just right before that, I was reading about math and Galileo and stuff, and it was I was reading some quotes, that kind of remind me a bit of some of the Twitter stuff that we set back and forth today, about who's thinking what and everything, because he's basically saying here he's set up. His father wants him to be a doctor, completely practical output of all of his skills. He wants to be a mathematician and simply study what is, not necessarily the world, the universe, the what's out there to see. It sounds like he studied in some of the religious institutions of his day, but I'm thinking about his time frame, and maybe it's just because of having a Christian background. I'm thinking, oh, great, yeah, 1500s, 15, so we're talking about the Reformation and all that stuff, and all the people starting to argue back and forth, and and he gets to this spot where he's talking, I think about, probably flat earth looks and things. And he's going, can you look out there and see how we are in relationship to the things outside of ourselves, and what is really moving us, or, what's static, what's moving. So, and then he's making these things about how he's called to the people of his day, the intelligent, the really educated, the intelligent people. And he's put forward some of his ideas, and they're rejecting them. And they don't even come and look at his telescope. They do nothing except sit there going, in my mind anyways, don't be stupid. Of course, everything is about us, and God has ordained that the entire being in the universe is going to rotate around us, and we are sitting here on this wide thing. And he's like, take a look. To me, that's, I think, what I was picturing when I was describing religious. I'm thinking sometimes we try so hard to be religious, which we think is that which honors God. In the end, we basically, I don't know, maybe insult him or something by not actually seeing. And I have days where I wonder if I am very much a religious person, and that, I've gone through different phases of trying very hard to connect with what I see of God. And even in reading this book, there are so many things that are obviously outside of my understanding at this time. But I'll talk about the things that I relate to. So obviously there's something in that give and take of life where I've had a glimpse of some of these things. But I'll lose touch with that if I just sit around only reading the Bible, if I sit locked in my room and I don't actually have anything to which I can relate it. I kind of think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a lot of, I think this is a lot of what the book, what the Rav is talking about, because that's part of Judaism, is kind of like what I'm seeing as a religion of action, of behaviors. But I do want to say, I'm going to challenge the dichotomy in terms of calling it religious, because I don't know And I don't know if like this book also will like the Rav is also thinking about this like this, because so I just learned something yesterday. I had like a course, like our local Chabad is doing a course. So so the dichotomy in this course is talking about, and I think it maps in some way to the religious man and the cognitive man, and it maps onto the fatalist and the self-reliant person, right? So I feel like what you described in terms of the people that are, Galileo, or the person telling them, look at the stat, like look at it and you can see. They're just like, they say, no, it's like you said, it's ordained, it's fate. Like we already know what is out there. We don't need to. So, and that's the religious, that's the fatalist. And then there was the self-reliant, which maybe kind of maps onto the cognitive, which is more about like, I can see all the answers in the observable field that I'm in. And I feel like maybe what this book is trying to say is that there is like the golden mean there. And in Judaism, the term that they give to this is bitachon, which is trust, which is like trust in God. So, and the rabbi was really careful about saying like you trust God in something, but you're not a fatalist in terms of like there. On the one hand, there's trust in God. On the other hand, you understand that you need to do the things in this world to participate, and that's expected from you. So I don't know if that seems to. I don't know, Sandy. I don't know if that connects to what he said. If you feel like that connects.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, and I was sorry. I was pinging back to what Elijah said about Bob Dylan, and I was going, what was that? So what did he say? Because it almost reminds me of that in a different way, that you've got to. And I don't remember enough Dylan to know if it does actually touch on the place you were mentioning, why you mentioned that song. But when Ben was talking, it was that thinking of you've got to trust somebody. The only somebody to really trust is God. But we've broken that concept in so many ways. And yeah, and so I'm listening to what you're saying, that's what this book is about, is learning to trust God. In for me anyways, that is one of the challenge points in my life, that from when we first started studying this, or when I first started talking to Jacob, and he'd talk about how he really doesn't like hospitals. They're super necessary. They do amazing good work, but the good work they do is so terrible because of what it is,
Yeah.
That's the kind of place I think of when I think of the word trust. And that's just because of having such great need for the hospitals and what they do, and having to walk out, give evidence to my trust early on with my son. And even at that, it isn't really the doctors that can make anything right. They can use their skills. They can do what they can do.
Mm-hmm. And you do what you can do, right? That's the I don't know if they call it the collaboration, or I mean that's kind of like this really weird dynamic, or like hard dynamic to think about, of like trusting and also like just like participating at the same time. Yeah.
I wonder if our understanding of religiosity, it seems like it's very much influenced by Protestantism, right? Because in Protestantism, there's like 5 different solas, and one of them is sola fide, which means only faith. So, I was raised Catholic, and so there's always this idea of faith and works. And I think the Orthodox also say something about faith and works due to the Book of Jude. But because we kind of live in a Protestant culture, I think that this creates the understanding that like religion is merely an act of like faith or thinking, instead of it also having this participatory aspect to it. This is why you have people who focus on like the liturgy, right? Where you have like this liturgistic aspect. And you can even see this in like, Sandy, you mentioned being like an Anglican, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like there's a difference between
growing up Anglican, which would be similar to Catholic, but then more the Reformation guys from, when Galileo was studying the universe, that era.
Yeah. And so, well, like on my father's side, we're Methodist. And so then there's like high church and low church within like the Anglican tradition of like, are you a high church Anglican, a low church Anglican? Are you like a high church Methodist or a low church Methodist? And things like that of kind of like participation. And I think that, the Rav kind of mentions in here cognitive man, which is like a man who does stuff, right? As opposed to cognitive, who is just thinking. And that, he's saying that there has to be more than just, thinking. Like,
Hello.
I don't know. Hello, Yosef.
Hi.
Did any of you guys have to read Siddhartha in school?
Yep.
Okay. And so, you kind of have this idea of like, the Buddhist or the ascetic within Hindu tradition where he goes off into the mountains or whatever, all alone, and kind of has this like kind of enlightenment. And then, he denies his body and denies the world. And I think that the Rav is saying like, no, you have to participate. So I think that it's maybe, a false understanding of what religion is.
Well, and so that's interesting in terms of how I'm engaging with this book, because you mentioned liturgy and that came up somewhere else this week. I forget where. Oh, no, I know where. But anyway, it's one of the words that I remember from when I first was meeting Jacob and talking to us about, I sat in on his Hebrew Bible study with him and Jason, and did that, so you're brand new here, so now we're going to make you do the closing prayer, and got the typical, that's a very Protestant prayer lecture. And what he directed me to was to think about liturgy, those things that we say and we repeat, and told me to go and read the Psalms. And then for the next while, I went back to thinking about that aspect of what I learned in Anglican as opposed to Reformed traditions of, and I think about it when I listen to Rabbi Malott. I was listening to his things because of the cantors, because you sing, and in the Anglican Church, portions of the liturgy are sung in, what do you call it, contretemps, back and forth between the priest and the people, which I miss that kind of thing. So I'm kind of curious in the sense of what you were pointing out. Yeah, I think part of the problem is this overarching sort of Christian takeover of everything is about the mind. It's how you think and approach things, and this is what faith is. You kind of grab this idea, and it kind of messes. But when Ben was talking about the link he was going to send, and about the scents and the smells and I guess in a weird way, are those also in a sense not nonverbal forms of liturgy, that kind of almost like like some kind of engagement with, and I'm sorry, that's kind of a weird, this comes out of a partially Halakhic Man and partially other conversations this week where I'm thinking, oh, there's a lot more to, because I always thought liturgy in my mind, I was going, well, liturgy, that must mean word, service of the word. But they were like, no, it focuses on the word service. What Ben was saying about that, it's that what you do, it's the movement, it's the motion. And I'm like, well, I don't recall talking very much about that motion of life and of faith and trust and walking things out in the same way in the 21st plus years that I spent from going into a Reformed perspective, which is kind of very live in your head in some respects, as I did in my early years in the Anglican Church, where it was a lot more tangible, like motion, things you participatory, I think you said.
Yeah. Were you Presbyterian? Or did you go to Presbyterian churches?
Oh, okay. I totally apologize. I totally apologize to Ben and Joseph. Okay, so when my ex-husband and I moved to our former the church I spent 25 years in, when we moved so our son could live at home and to go to the deaf school, because I'm Anglican, the Reformed Church kind of grill you. They make you redo your profession of faith if they don't already have paperwork and documentation on you. So I had to do that. And part of that is explaining, like normally you would say, I have been a member here. Here's my paperwork. This is, my profession of faith. This is blah, 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 blah. I swear I just about made a couple of elders fall off their chairs because they wanted to know my church history. And I said, I looked at them and I went, so I'm kind of like a Heinz 57. And in the Reformed Church, you don't say that. This comes from here, which means, boy, you must have real problems with what you believe. This obviously indicates that you can't stick to anything and you're going to like bail on us the first second that we do something that, because I gave them the history of both sides of my family, and it added up to about 10 different denominations, and yeah. So yeah, Presbyterian did hit in there somewhere in the mix. Yes.
Yeah.
Baptist, some version of Scottish Pentecostals, Scottish Episcopal, which I think is like Anglican if you were English, but you're not, you're Scottish, so you're adamantly not English or something like that.
Yep.
Not Church of England, absolutely not. So yeah, and there was Methodist United Church, so I am a horror too. Of elders.
Definitely in good company for sure. Yeah, and I mean I think that's even what the next kind of paragraph on page 58 says. The Halakhic man can never accept the ruling of Maimonides opposing the recital of Piyutim, the liturgical poems and songs of praise, where he's saying like, I don't know this Maimonides because I don't know Maimonides, but it is kind of, you just think of, I don't know, the Levites in the temple singing, and then how can you say that like you can't participate in anything?
That's not what's happening here.
Okay, well, it's good that you're here.
Yes. So Jacob had asked me if I could come. I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to like commit. I'm kind of going to be working on my dissertation in the background, like being a good student, but I'm going to like keep an ear open. And yeah, I don't remember. There's a couple different debates over Piyutim specifically in their role, and I don't remember which one version Maimonides specifically goes after. But I'm going to do my best. So the Piyutim are non-scriptural poems that were written usually by the cantors themselves. They became I would consider them a very high art form. They were, there are a lot of rules about the poetry, especially in the Spanish version of Piyutim that Maimonides would have been kind of facing. Like all of the rules of Golden Age Muslim Spain poetry brought into a Jewish context essentially. So lots of rules about it's not like English or even romance language poetry at all, because Semitic languages work a very different way. But it's a form of poetry, long and short phonemes, and there's kind of form the meters and the feet of the meters, but not. So you can think of it kind of like iambic pentameter in some ways, but you're not really. It's rare that you're looking at things like rhyme necessarily. I mean, sometimes they rhyme, but it's not really not like the type of poetry we're talking about here. We're talking about much more kind of very mathematical and very grammatical. Like the grammar really matters a lot in these things. You can make up some words to some. There's like creative processes that are allowed. But like anyway, so it's a very high form of art. And most Jewish prayer is communal. Like everyone just says it quietly to themselves, and or the prayer leader, cantor, whatever, is going to be saying it out loud, and you are saying along with them quietly, and or you're doing something like Sandy was mentioning, where you have kind of a call and response, so between the cantor and the congregation. The piyutim are non-scriptural. They're added much later. So they're like new, like people complain about new liturgies now and like adding new hymns or whatever. Like, they're not traditional, and they're also much harder for like the common people to understand and connect to, because like they're really written for like the rabbinic elite. Like they're going to be works of like, you need to really know or appreciate like a huge corpus to like get all their allusions and references. Usually they're very densely packed with either midrashic references, sometimes Bible, but usually a mix of rabbinic and biblical stuff. And they can be beautiful and very impressive. They can also like double the length of your service easily. And Maimonides, as much as sometimes people accuse them of like a certain type of elitism, on the other hand, wanted to make some things very accessible, and like everyone could take part in. And he felt that piyutim were really kind of there more for showing off of the cantor's like skill and ability to write these things, not necessarily perform them. I mean, we don't really know how they were performed. We don't have a lot of evidence for Jewish music. Actually, from the time of Maimonides, we have the first kind of musical notation of Jewish music by a convert who had been studied Gregorian chant with a monk. But like outside of his single witness, like we really have no idea how these things sounded. And he was in a different culture than Maimonides. Anyway, so yeah, we don't know, but we imagine that some of the piyutim are kind of written to have call and response, but usually like the call part is very, very complicated and long, and you need to have a written text in front of you. In an age before the printing press, like they were basically impossible for people to memorize most of these piyutim. So there was a lot of resistance to them in some circles, and some people really like them. I mean, there's also like Italian Jews seem to be really into their piyutim at the time, and the Spanish Jews, some of them were and some of them weren't, and depending, Maimonides didn't like them. And lots of people over the years have fought them. They see them as interruptions to the main part of the prayer. We have rules where you're allowed to insert them and not insert them. That became more standardized over time. So that's what he's complaining about. He's not complaining about music. He's not complaining about some like the Levites and like Psalms, like actual Psalms. Like that's all fine for him. His prayer book is one of the shortest of like the ancient prayer books that we kind of have a copy of. He just wanted it to be accessible. He didn't necessarily want it to be like a happy, like singy, like kumbaya experience either. Like that's not how he that's just not what prayer was like in the 12th century. But he definitely wanted it to be, something everyone could take part in and like at least not be there for hours, kind of just like listening to some guy perform.
And so is Adon Olam considered a...
Yes. So Adon Olam is a 14th century piyut. So is Yigdal. Ironically, Yigdal is the piyut based on the 13 principles of Maimonides. Now you'll know that those are much shorter piyutim, and the piyutim that have kind of stuck around and became standardized tend to be short, easier to remember ones. They're like the songs that are sung at the Sabbath table are some of the kind of most well-known ones, but like certainly within like the normal standard liturgy, Adon Olam, Yigdal, Kel Adon, which is the one on the Sabbath. It's an alphabetic acrostic, and a probably very old one. And piyutim, the oldest piyutim we have are like 3rd, 4th century, so they're pretty old. I mean, they definitely predate Maimonides. Even when we say they're modern, like they're just like post-biblical era modern. The whole Siddur, like the whole Jewish liturgy is rabbinic anyway, basically. It's all modern in a sense, but the piyutim are a little bit younger than the Siddur for the most part, give or take. Some of them might have been around at the same time. Some of the Siddur seems to have partial piyutim as within it, and there's whole arguments over like whether this started as a separate poem and we've only preserved little bits here and there because it was too long or too complicated, or they lost the rest of it, which happens a lot in Jewish history.
And so how would a piyut in style compared to a psalm?
It depends. There's a lot of different styles of piyutim. There's the Spanish style, which we talked about a bit, and that certainly influenced a whole genre. But there were other versions. So the French, style of piyutim was very different. It was not influenced as much by the Muslims. There's also a Byzantine style that's very Byzantine, like very influenced by the Byzantine imperial kind of court styles of poetry. Eventually, kind of the Spanish style wins out as far as becoming the dominant one, because especially after 1492, when the Spanish Jews all spread around the world. But even before that, like people like saw like, wow, this is really impressive. And usually the Spanish ones don't necessarily, well, not totally, they often aren't crazy long compared to some of like the French ones. This is something people will talk about a lot in the month leading up to Rosh Hashanah, because slichot, which are like penitential, like these are the repentance piyutim about like going through processes of tshuva, so like repentance, atonement, asking forgiveness. Those types of piyutim, like people like the Sephardi ones better than the Ashkenazi ones, so like the Spanish style over the European or the Central European, because they're much more singable. And so because they followed stricter rules of poetry and meter, if whatever form, it's much easier to put them to a tune, and that made them very popular in the modern era.
Do they also want to wake up at 12 o'clock?
They want to wake up when?
Do they also want to wake up at 12 o'clock like the Sephardim?
Right. Well, there's a difference here. Right, Ashkenazim usually do piyutim before the first prayer in the morning, at least in the modern era. Sephardim can maintain or preserve the older custom of doing them in the middle of the night, but they're much shorter. It's more singable and they're shorter. So even though they're doing them for a whole 40 days as opposed to just 2 weeks, especially if you're in Israel, it's very fun. It's very social. Like it's very like. And if you're young, I guess it's not such a big deal, right? It's a whole thing. It's enjoyable. I mean, I'm Ashkenazi, and I usually go to Ashkenazi piyut, and I go to Ashkenazi ones at night, honestly, because like that fits my schedule better anyway. But
okay.
But it just depends. Yeah. Anyway, this is super off topic, but yeah. So piyutim, I love piyutim, and I'm a really weird person. Like Jacob will tell you that. Like I'm super into liturgy and the history of liturgy and the Siddur, and like I study, well, not since my dissertation, but before my dissertation, I was studying piyutim in my free time, and like, yeah, I really enjoy.
With the next dissertation.
I was thinking, do we need to write a poem to your dissertation and how you're actually going to finish it?
Yes, well, yeah,
maybe
have to add more time, Anyway,
the world is full of too many wonderful things to know all at once.
Very true. Okay, I'll let you continue.
Okay. That is actually interesting.
I'm trying to think of what we were talking about before.
Well, I think we were talking about religiosity and like faith and whether you need to have actions or not.
You had given us a definition just before that about trust as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and Yosef probably can elaborate and correct me on anything, because I learned this more yesterday, pretty much. But it's interesting also from, I guess I can try to connect it to what you said in terms of like thinking about it as faith, and how faith is all in your head, or it's something. Yeah, so it's something, or it's more lofty. And bitachon, the way that the rabbi was explaining it, is that it's almost like a level beyond faith. Is like it's like knowing, it's like knowing. It's equivalent to knowing, like ladat, and like in the in Hebrew. So there's a commandment like in Exodus when it talks about giving of the Torah in Sinai, or somewhere around that, where a lot of the commandments are given. It's specifically about you to know, to investigate. So that kind of connects also to like, and when you investigate God, you also investigate. I mean, the creation here, like like you don't have just faith in that is in your head or is conceptual. It's also participatory. It's also you going further and investigating it and doing things. And I really like also in the book, it mentions something about how you have all these principles that are in some way are immeasurable or effable, right? Like kindness or love or righteousness, but the commandment or the mitzvot are trying to bring those down to earth and give specific measurement, like 10% for tzedakah. That's being kind to an extent, right? Like that's the measurement of kindness. Or this is a measurement of kindness. So it really tries to bring these things down. And maybe there's a connection between bitachon and that in some way, but I don't know. I don't know if Yosef, you have any thoughts about that.
Well,
So
He
Sammy
may-
might know, remember this. You don't know this, Ben. My dissertation is on trust.
Oh, okay.
It's actually my like professional field of study and interest.
So you have no opinion on this whatsoever?
So nothing. No, you're good. That's perfect.
Okay.
So
words are fuzzy because we use a lot of these words equivocally. But Norman Lamb used, I think was one of the earlier people to distinguish this. So he got it from somewhere in philosophy of trust, that the difference between faith that versus faith in. So you have faith that something is true, let's say, versus faith in something, which is trusting it, not as propositional necessarily. It's beyond that. Now, whether it's relational, I would say. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's right. It could be. We can take it as participatory. I think it's a little limiting in some ways. I know, like, I know that's kind of the impulse, is to take Ladat that way. Ladat can mean it could be any of the. Well, it can be propositional or participatory or both. It's not like it can be. Like Hebrew is flexible enough. It's just like the way that we called all of those faith, or for Vervaeke, he called those all like types of knowledge. Like Hebrew is ambiguous, like even probably more ambiguous than English in some ways. But this is really well illustrated in Exodus, because when God says, I'm going to do these signs and wonders so the Egyptians will know me, it's that they're going to kind of view and like see what God does. But it's really like a propositional thing. It's not for them to like trust in God or have a relationship with God or have a participation.
Mm-hmm.
It is basically to establish a proposition based on evidence. I mean, it's, certainly empirical like evidence, but like it's evidence based. A couple chapters later, when they're at Sinai, he's going to use Ladat in a much more participatory ways, like you're saying, because seeing the signs and wonders is not sufficient. And this is kind of highlighted in a few places in the text where they play with the idea of emunah. So like when they saw the splitting of the sea and they had emunah, which is normally what we translate as faith.
Mm-hmm.
And they said they had faith in God and in Moses, his servant. But it means something a little bit different there, because it's like, not that they believe them here in a different way than they believe them at the plagues, as far as like propositional evidence or empirical evidence for a proposition. Here, like they knew that they could rely or, trust or have a reliance on, that God split the sea, even though they didn't think that was going to happen. That God took care of them, that Moses took care of them, that he wasn't going to just leave them to die in the desert. Of course, like 3 days later, they're saying, "Why did you bring us here let us die in the desert?" So it wasn't clearly enough. And there's this whole interplay at Sinai between seeing and hearing, and like that seeing is insufficient essentially for establishing faith. But or not. I mean, there's this whole play because that's the simple reading seems to be that seeing's not enough, and there's this higher level in hearing, and that either because seeing is some sort of like facade, or it's kind of like the Jews look for signs in the New Testament, like that's, which is kind of playing on that same thing, that it's like not, signs are not sufficient. And you see this, I mean, it's a continuous Jewish theme, whether you're looking at the Jewish or Christian texts, and at least the early Christian texts. Once they start getting more Greek influence, things kind of change. So the early Christian texts, let's say.
Kind of a weird question, or
Yeah.
maybe it isn't a weird question. I'm not sure. But when we're talking, so you've used a few words that have come up in some of my listening contexts this week, but it also makes me think of a couple other references, because you're using the words participation or participatory, proposition and participation as sort of a contrast of types. But then you were also talking about faith and knowing, and the interaction between faith and knowing, kind of. And that brings up three typical things for me. And hello, you have a cat. Sorry. I feel like I'm going, oh, look, squirrel. That's a saying. So one of the things everybody argues about with the Bible, Genesis, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and then they have Cain. We talk about in English the fact that if you look at the word snow in English, it's a singular, but if you look at snow in some of the Inuit languages, well, there's a whole plethora of words for snow, depending on what kind of snow and what your reference is and to what it relates, et cetera, et cetera. And in sign language, when we were learning it's one of these things, you can just sign no. Do you know Hey, do you know Florida? You know, like, but they don't say it that way. They say touch, finished, as in, oh, do you know Florida? Like, actually know it? Have you been there? You know, what kind of knowing do you know?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's something in what you're saying that kind of falls into that basket in my life and experience of, yeah, faith in no. It isn't either or. It goes back to that you're not using the words, you know, like, is it, what did I say? Is it propositional or is it is it proposition or no? What was the other word?
Participatory.
That was the choice of words. Those things don't live in completely different spaces, is what I'm hearing you say. And so when we try to talk about some of these concepts and what it looks like when we drop it into our boxes that sit in, this is my religious understanding, you know, from whatever history or whatever context we come from, it sometimes sounds like we're separating those two things to say them in it's either or. It's always that dichotomy split. But I don't get the sense that's what you're saying either. And that's
I mean, the separation is kind of is more convenience than of like actual, like, and I think you see this in Soloveitchik's pretty good at this. Halakhic Man, and then his other big book, Lonely Man of Faith, he's going to play in both those books with like two different character types, and then in Halakhic Man they come together in a third, in a synthesis, whereas in Lonely Man of Faith he has two character types that can't come together, that they're in a dialectic, that are non-mergeable. He ends up having these 5 types, which sort of kind of map to the 4 types of knowing from Vervaeke, plus like a 5th that doesn't really fit in. And like there's a whole fun discussion that can be had about like how the 2 books relate to each other, and then also how they might relate to this little corner as like a unit. And that's not including, I would say, the 3rd book in that group of books for him, which is From There You Shall Seek, which is the sequel to Halakhic Man.
Try to get the one in the middle then.
Is that the Halachic Mind, or isn't there then another?
Yeah. So no, it's called From There You Shall Seek. I'm trying to remember. In Hebrew, it's very clear that it's a sequel because he called them like, he made one a play on word on the other, but I can't remember where they are in Hebrew at the moment. In English, at least his original title in Hebrew. He eventually changed it for various reasons because they came out at very different times in his life. different orders. But yeah. Anyway, yeah. To me, the 4 or 5 types of knowing, P's, whatever you want to call them, exist in like a very tight set of feedback loops. There's no like set order. You can kind of come into the cycle at any point, and they all kind of reinforce each other and build off each other. And like the goal is kind of this very holistic, integrated thing, which may or may not be possible. I mean, Soloveitchik kind of points out that like 2 of them might be totally diametrically opposed and not fully combinable, or at least live in just a inherent tension that has no synthesis. Whereas this book like kind of shows maybe where they balance or have a harmony, or can be synthesized in some way. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's fuzzy, and yeah, different words have different I would call them different resolutions, right? So some words are you have a lot of words for very specific things, and sometimes you have very ambiguous languages or cultures.
Well, I really like that place because, like when I brought up the Inuit languages and things, there was I thought of that because you had said something else, and you just said now some things being fuzzy, and I thought sometimes I think that where it increases the number of words isn't because it's fuzzy, but because it's getting more, like, oh, this sounds stupid because I don't know anything at all really about math. It's just a picture in my head of something. Number back, I had a friend in Hydro, and I was talking to him about fractals and things and repetition. So when you get down to where the fractal goes down into, like smaller and smaller and smaller, it is still, depending on your point of view, the exact same size, but from our perspective, it is not. So that we could think that, well, we can't see it as clearly because either it's too big or it's too small for us to grasp. But really, that's only because of our perspective. And there's something in here about perspective too, and why, like the whole thing of why I went back to page 47 and God's challenge to build him a sanctuary, and it talks about, and Moses began to wonder, and I thought, poor Moses, yeah, I'm sure he did, because you think, how is that even possible? But I don't think it's because it's fuzzy. I think it's just that we don't yet have that perspective, and we cannot even begin to grasp God's perspective, that this whole section on how he contracts and how he fits himself too is even a thing. Like,
well, I think that's why Rebecca defends perspectival knowing as a separate thing from participatory and propositional. In part, I mean, he also has like other neuroscience reasons and stuff like that. But I think a big argument is that perspective, and for Rebecca, perspective knowing is kind of the base of all the other types of knowing, which I don't know if I totally agree with that, but he sees it as you can't have propositions without axioms, and axioms come from propositional knowing, and you can't have participation without having like being situated somewhere, and being situated somewhere gives you a perspective. It gives you like literally a point of view, like where you're situated in the situation before you can participate. So he sees it as kind of, and also he also argues this for procedural, though I don't think it's strong there, but whatever. I mean, he argues it that for everything, basically, from his view at least, everything has to be based in the perspectival first, and then kind of go filter into these other things. I think there are arguments to show that it can also be reversed, and like it doesn't necessarily have to go in that causal direction, but yeah.
I'll probably say something extremely heretical to Berfeki's perspective.
That's fine. I mean, I'm just saying,
my mind goes back to raising my son, and that place standing between cultures and trying to figure out how to help turn on the right things in his brain that will accommodate language, rather than trying to impose it upon him from outside, which you often would do with autistic people. And my mind drops back into that place where I said the sign for do you know X, Y, or Z? Well, so he wants to measure stuff. Yeah. So in measurement and things, you have to have certain features so that do you know this or that? You're measuring the knowability of things and where the person fits.
I mean, Rebecca isn't that much of a scientist. He's certainly willing to. He's much more existential than that. right? Like,
Is he? I
Yeah.
don't know. I only took one cognitive psych class. and
no,
I'm
no,
going,
but remember, he's coming at this from Zen Buddhism.
Is
So
he
for
really?
him, it's much more experiential and
Interesting.
existential.
Oh, drat. Now I got to go listen.
Yeah, I mean, he's more interesting than that. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you even measure perspective? Some of these things aren't really measurements for propositional knowing is the only one that can be. Well, propositional and procedural can be measured in ways that perspectival and participatory just can't. They're qualitative, right?
I'm just going to smile and close my mouth and stare at my
No, I
paper
mean, no, you can.
sanctuary and sizes and fractals in my mind.
Right, and I guess that's the challenge, right? That's the struggle. That's the challenge that I think desire for me. Desire is kind of like a key word here in terms of like a challenge that we should desire in terms of like being a part of taking the qualitative and making it quantitative, and taking the quantitative and figuring out the qualitative, right? So I mean, and I think even when you discuss the tzimtzum, what God does, that is also, I think, a way to look at that is also, people will say like that God didn't need to put himself into that ark or to have a space, but he desired that, right? And that is something that we want to be able to mimic or to do ourselves. So I guess in some way, yeah, it's saying that it's not like either like each one of those each one of those knowing is not oppositional to the other one. It's kind of like figuring out how to make sure that you're integrating them or have them, or something like that.
This book is not just a 3 read, it's going to be like 10 read or 20 read. It's like, I don't know if this is changing topic or staying on topic. On page 50, where it talks about the creation of the world took place on account of God's goodness. And where was it? A page over. Yeah, and over a page after you get reading through this spot on God creating the world and things, it's talking about at the bottom of 52, whether God created the world for the sake of his goodness, whether he created it for the sake of his grace. And it comes down to both views are incorrect. The world was created neither for the sake of his goodness nor for the sake of his grace, but for the sake of his will. And that kind of ties into what you were saying about desire. I'm sorry. It's one of those places where I just am going to sit and smile and have no clue what I'm talking about, but it's...
I think it does. I mean, for me, it does. Like will, yeah, I'm trying to translate it to Hebrew to kind of understand if there is connection in the language too. But yeah, it does. And I don't know, for me personally, it kind of like connects because like I really need to want this connection, because it's like it's never been part of my life, and it's something that's very far. So like if I wouldn't desire the connection with God, like it won't be something that appears. It's not something that feels so like it's sort of like a default. So that's why I'm connecting. Like I'm just connecting to that specific idea, because I see that as something that we're supposed to reflect. especially in the behaviors that we do in this world, where and we taking these lofty ideas, and and it would be an understatement to say that God is one of them, but all the values or all the virtues, and trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we engage with the world? How do we combine them with the world? How do we find them in the world? Yeah. So
when I read older books, sometimes you see things that sound kind of odd in the way we would say them now, but it would talk about so and so desired to whatever blah blah blah, which means, well, that we'd say, well, that I wanted to go to the store. Well, you'd never say I desired to such and such, so that whatever. But we might say, and we wouldn't say, well, I willed, the way we use it in this context. But you say, oh, I wanted some milk. I will go to the store. I desire some milk. I will. And you're talking about a place of interaction that, which goes back to that contraction, because I'm looking like the place at the bottom I read about is neither for his goodness nor for his grace, but for the sake of his will. When it goes up, talking up onto the top of the next page on 53, it continues that discussion. Actually, I'm sorry, my mind's dropping back down for a second, because that's interesting. So the sake of his will, if I go between the two, it says, this view set down by Maimonides as a firm principle in the guide, prevalent in many forms in voluntaristic religious and metaphysical systems. For example, that of Solomon, sorry, I got to get into the light here. Solomon ibn Gabirol. I won't say this correctly, but basically Fountain of Life, which is the English of Mechor Hayim, and that of Duns Scotus, who was influenced by the former, is the very seal of Halakhic Man. The world was created in accordance with the will of God, who wills to contract his divine presence in it. Therefore, we're called, which is what you just said, therefore we're called to arrange our lives in accordance with this fundamental idea. He's touching on something really important here.
in what way do you think?
That one place that we just that we don't get is God. Why on earth would God will? What I said, Moses wondering, why on earth would God will to be with such messed up people as us? But there's a spot in a little further on, I think it is, where it's talking about, and I mentioned it at the beginning, that place where if we do things in a certain way, it's like we're insulting God, we're diminishing his nature or his ability or his something. And that's not what we intend to do. But because there again, our perspective doesn't get it. And that makes my mind go back to what you said about trust, is that we stumble over words like faith and belief and, and everything. But when I think about what I've been trying to express, and what we were just talking about, everything, raising my son has been one of the biggest, biggest, in a sense, faith lessons I had to do in life, or trust lessons, or, biblical lessons, or that kind of interactive place where we can talk about Vervaeke's intention in some of his, 4 Ps, and about how he thinks and whether he's thinking scientifically or religiously or philosophically or whatever. But this is super important because when I look at what I had to do with my son, it's that place where trust isn't a concept, it's something incredibly tangible and goes back to that participatory thing so that you don't actually get to know it unless you're right in the middle of it. And that's why I keep saying I'm sitting here smiling with no clue what I'm saying, or I'm sitting here kind of going, I want to just kind of groan because it almost hurts to be so close to feeling and understanding it, but I still can't actually do that. You know what I'm trying to say clearly. Language, English, maybe it is so inarticulate.
No, it's okay. Moses stuttered, and he was picked to be the one to communicate God's will and to talk to God, right?
Good thing we had a stuttering example to lead us as our first, one of our early prophets, not our first one, but
Yeah, I mean he's the great orator of like the whole book of Deuteronomy, and yet he, in part he's only able to do that because he has this challenge of expressing himself. Yeah, and so I think part of what's happening here is Maimonides is getting involved in a dispute within Plato, because almost everyone else is going to basically say, specifically in Euthyphro, right? So Euthyphro has these famous horns of this dilemma, right? So there's two positions. Are the god for Plato, of course, there's multiple gods, but we can make the monotheistic context because that's how Maimonides is understanding it. Is God good and therefore does good things, or is what God does good by definition because God does it? And Maimonides, unlike the other position, is unlike the first position, he's going to go with the second position. He's going to say it's purely God's will, and whatever God wills becomes the definition of good and loving and like all those things. And so for him, will is above love, which other Jewish philosophers disagree. Forget obviously other Greek and Christian philosophers disagree. But Maimonides is by far the most clear about kind of which side he falls on here. He doesn't mince words. And he sees this, everything has to be an act of will for him for a lot of reasons. But one is because there's this idea, which is, so I know, so you're, Sandy, coming from the reforms, or I mean, from many traditions, as you said, but let's say from a slew of Protestant traditions, where at least some of them, right, have this idea where kind of the Holy Spirit has to come to you to open you up to faith, and until that happens, you won't get it, you can't grasp it necessarily, and then the Holy and whatever, right? Is that kind of sort of close to expressing it?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. And when I first came across that idea in Christianity, I was I've realized later that it's not so opposite, but initially I was like, wow, it's the opposite of the Jewish idea, which is the highest point of free will. This is a Talmudic passage, but it's a fairly old one. The highest point of free will in Judaism is in fact is they say fear of heaven, but really essentially whether you believe in God, have faith in God, trust God, or awe, or whatever you want to call it. I don't care what you can play with, which P or type of knowing or whatever. It doesn't really matter here. That's the highest thing, and that's the freest act we have. Everything else kind of flows from that. One could kind of see it as if I don't know. I'm not a Peterson guy, but I picked up enough language here. So the person or Peugeot, the thing you put at the top of your hierarchy, or the telos or whatever, that's going to then flow down and define the rest of the hierarchy. Or the thing that you're putting at the perspectival top then is going to form the axioms that affect all your propositions, or participation, right? So so the rabbis are pretty adamant that's the highest act of free will, is setting that, as opposed to God coming to you, the Holy Spirit coming to you and opening you up to it, the highest point of freedom and the least coerced you are is in that act. Maimonides is a really big fan of that, because he sees this as like the highest form of imitatio Dei, right, of imitating God. So God, got the highest level of God's freedom, like God's most divine aspect in some way is this will that like everything flows from. And therefore us in the image of God, our biggest thing that we have is free will. And, this also informs how he reads the Garden of Eden and lots of other places. For him, everything's about free will. And yeah, there's other readings, and I'm not sure that he convinces me everywhere this is like always the most ultimate thing. But for the most part, I think this is a pretty strong Jewish, undercurrent that is through lots of sources. Yeah, and I guess I can see why this would create like a difference between Protestantism in some way, and especially something that's very faith propositional based. But it also has, right? He's really trying. He's not thinking about that. He's responding to the Greek philosophers for the most part, and the Muslim is influenced by Greek philosophers when he's taking this position. It's interesting because in the next generation, or 2 generations after Maimonides, you're going to have 2 people who are going to say the highest thing is love over will. Chaste Kreskas and Abulafia are both going to argue love. God's love is kind of the thing above will, which obviously it plays much more nicely with the Christian frame. And then there's others who will argue that it's about goodness or these other things, grace, etc. And for Maimonides, grace, like God's mercy, right? Jacob argues this all the time, right? Like when he talks about atonement theories and why he dislikes a lot of the Christian ones, is like God can choose to forgive whoever he wants to, like whether the procedure is done correctly or not, whether, like God sees the heart and knows, what his own plans are, and like has a, God's will is always the ultimate thing, and God can choose. So and this runs through Maimonides' understanding of atonement too. Like it's the ultimate act of will to forgive someone, whether they, which is also related to trust. Right? Repairing trust, forgiving betrayal, forgiving sin against you, is this ultimate act of will, like overriding basically, let's say, your rational faculty, your imaginative faculty, like all these other things, evidence-based, even participation in some ways would say like this is aspirational. It's not in the being mode. Like it's beyond. It's in a different space. So yeah. So for him, and so right, we have a parallel idea to the lamb slain at the foundation of the world in Judaism, which is that the altar was created as one of the 10 things created, or one of the 7 things created before creation. So that the ability to repent was created before creation, to atone. And that it's because it's outside of the natural order. It's like a miracle, like it's an act of grace in like a Christian, like capital G way, but like it's beyond beyond natural law, order, like reason. Like it's a pure act of will.
I'm sorry, my life is flashing before my eyes. I'm putting all kinds of things in place. Do you guys know what he's talking about? Because this hits me in a spot, and if I start talking about it, I'll just start talking about it.
Talk all you want, Sandy.
I was just going to say I, again, feel completely heretical because, in a sense, I have struggled with some of these concepts a number of years. Around forgiveness, around will, around all these things. But what comes to my mind as you're talking and as I'm picturing life is there is no love without will. Couldn't have said that 10 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if this connects, but just like what this brings to mind to me, what you just said is like I was just There was just like the parasha for the week. He's talking about the sacrifices, and the rabbi there is talking about how he gives about how like the sacrifices don't necessarily mean like what does God actually need, or what does he want? Is it the smoke that comes, like this, the smell of the meat, of the fat? Is it like, what is it exactly? And he gives a parable also in terms of like connecting that to a husband and wife, and how the wife tells her husband to like just express it with flowers. So like, just buy me flowers, and the husband is like, yeah, flowers. Flowers are, they last for 2 days. They cost a lot of money. Like, why do I, like, I don't understand. Why won't we buy just like something more practical, like a new dishwasher? Like, I don't know. I'll buy a dishwasher for our anniversary.
Yep.
And the wife says, well, the because you don't understand flowers, that will show me that you love me.
Yeah, so Maimonides goes in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe that's where the rabbi's kind of getting it from a bit, right? Like, and then people have problems with this, and I have problems with this, and to some extent, because he's going to go to the point of, he's not going to go to the point necessarily of irrationality. He doesn't. He doesn't buy into like the same mystery in the same way that like Catholic might, or a Trinitarian might. So some Trinitarians argue like the whole point is that it's a mystery and you can't understand it, and therefore it like is above reason. And Maimonides isn't going to go quite there, but for the commandments, for the mitzvot, he's going to say, if you do a mitzvah just because you think it's a good thing to do, because you come to it rationally from a natural law perspective, Jew or Noahide, by the way, he applies this to both. If you just do it because like you think it's a good thing to do, it doesn't count. You have to do it because you know it's the will of God, and only then, because you know it's his love language, or whatever you're going to call that metaphor that he just used, right? You know that it's what he wills. That's why you're doing it. That's the only reason why you should be doing it. Now you can come up with nice explanations. I mean, Maimonides spends a lot of time coming up with explanations, and what we don't call them reasons for mitzvah. In Hebrew, we call them ta'amei ha-mitzvah, the tastes of the mitzvah, which is we can't ever say we know why a mitzvah happened. We never know why a commandment was commanded. We can't, because God's above us, like in everything, and how he thinks and the reasons and all that stuff. But we can come up with potential reasons, or reasons that kind of fit with like patterns and that kind of make sense to us. So we don't call them these are the reasons. We say these are the flavors or the tastes. Right. And Maimonides, that comes from him, because he was like, you don't do it because of the reason, and you can't necessarily ever know the reason. He was very clear about kind of his like.
Yeah, but there's also an emphasis on, I feel like, even for Maimonides, but even when I was even from that specific rabbi, of like, you at least don't start with the rational or with knowing. Like, first we do and we know. I mean, that's like basically right in Nasev Nishma. So I mean, that's, yeah, we'll do, and then we will hear and understand.
So there's an interesting debate over that, because Nasev Nishma, we usually see it. Well, let's quote from Exodus. So we will do and we will listen, and which is in the end of 2 portions ago, the Parsha Mishpatim. Now earlier in that portion, it said we will do. It didn't say we will listen. And God, for a while, says, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me, and then eventually he says, I'll just show you, because they're not getting it. It seems, right? So there's this kind of play between listening and seeing, and they're not listening to him. But like seeing helps, and then so there's a whole question kind of is, is it good or bad that they have to kind of go that route, that they can't, is it a concession to human psychology,
right,
and therefore it's like less than the ideal, or is it like that is like by necessity how it has to be, and like it's not really a concession, that's just like it's the ideal because what is what ought to be. So there's obviously this whole other element that Maimonides is not fighting against, because it's coming from a different place. He's a philosopher, and especially like in the text that Soloveitchik has been quoting, like at his philosophical, like, best. There's this whole other impulse in Judaism, which is like you practice first, like procedural knowledge. The one we haven't talked about as much in this conversation, right? You create habits of the body and of the mind, and as you build those habits, they shape your thoughts and your perceptions and your attention, and eventually, so we say like even you should do commandments even if you don't want to, even if you don't agree with them, even if you don't understand them, you should do them because eventually the action of doing them will bring you to the right intention. This is very different than the faiths works arguments in Christianity in some extent. And one could see why this fits uncomfortably, I think, in a Christian framework. But like but my modern psychology is very much kind of drawn, and maybe that's because psychology has a lot of Jews involved in it, and they kind of pick this up. Hard to say, like whether this is where this fits in is a little complicated. But like Peterson certainly talks about this, creating like physically embodied habits of like cleaning your room and doing these things, even if like you don't have a plan for your life, and even if you're not all together and don't have that final telos will, you start with regular, consistent, daily or weekly or whatever structured habits, and you build up. And that's like a very, the rabbis explicitly talk about this in a way like 1900 years ago already, but they're picking up on themes that are like, I'd say, biblical, because they make clear like, well, we get this from here and it's kind of obvious, so we don't have to really explain it.
I don't know if I just see it as procedural, like for me, and I'm not. Yeah, I'm not too tied. I'm like, I don't really understand too much of like the technical, but because for me, I'm trying to think about my own life and examples from my life of like the habits are not necessarily just to get me to do something. It's also to get me to understand.
Yes, no, that's exactly that's the whole reason for the habit. I mean, not all the whole reason. Sometimes, primarily, right, the reason is we want a world that is just and has peace and fair and all those things that like are the social justice aspect of Judaism, which is like why Abraham was picked, right, in the first place. And this is like a big debate between Paul and like rabbinic Judaism, right? Because we say he was picked because the verse says you're picked because you're going to teach your kids justice and righteousness, and Paul said he was described faith before that, and that matters. That matters. Of course, we also say the text isn't chronological, which like turns that on its head a little bit.
I have a weird question that probably comes from the fact that I'm very lucky that I haven't got a clue what all of the references are that you guys talk about yet. And so all I've got is some of that little bit of where it's seen application in my life. So when I hear something and I'm going, oh, I know that reference, but it's like that, whole, do you know Florida? Have you touched it? Your feet stood there. This, what you just were sharing and what you and Ben were just talking about, reminds me of when I was learning ASL. I have had glasses since I was 7. I have difficult eyesight, and I was always terrified that I would not be able to learn the language of sign because it's visual, And so you were talking about, well, God was telling them, and essentially, here, let me show you. And then we get over to the discussion you just had, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, the only way I got through my first sign language class, which was very particular, we had hired a teacher to come up to sit with a bunch of friends and family and go through it with us. And I learned so much from that one spot because I'm fighting my ability to comprehend it based on, can I see what he's doing? My mother-in-law, who is Dutch, is fighting her ability to hear what he is saying. Which sounds stupid because I just told you he's signing, but because it's not really, it makes total sense in my memory because she's Dutch and he's explaining ASL to her in English so as it will help her to understand what he's saying. And I had to get his attention in my stumbling version of 200 signs I learned in preparation for not freaking out while learning my first few hundred signs. I managed to say to him, but she's Dutch. English doesn't help her at all. She doesn't know what you're telling her in English, so she's not getting it in sign. Whereas me, I'm sitting there going, my language was tactile. So I'm going, don't worry if you have a clue what he's saying, copy the movement and motion. So I'm listening from this place of, I don't know enough Peterson. I don't know enough Vervaeke. I have never really spent a lot of time reading Maimonides, and I'm just jumping into this book with whatever I've got to bring. But I'm going, oh my goodness, that's what it is. It's trying to learn sign language in Dutch by help of English, because I can only see it if I let my hands move so that I can understand tactilely what he's saying and explain it to my mother-in-law, who's trying to not cry while she's trying to learn sign language for her deaf grandson. And I'm like, this is beautiful. This is how God works.
Yeah. And that's exactly an example. I feel like that's exactly an example of like how we bring lofty ideas into, like, the only example that you can give is your embodied life, which is exactly what I was thinking about. I have that from like thinking about wrestling and how I have these concepts that people will tell me that I'm supposed to do, and I can maybe understand them or try to understand them if I watch a video about how to do it, but I will need to like do it 1,000 times before I can actually understand it. Mm-hmm. And then even to explain it, I won't be able to explain it. Like it'll take, like I won't even be able to explain it in words. I will be able to explain it if I do it, and then maybe I'll be able to explain it in words. But this is kind of like meta, right? It's like we talk about this, but like our examples are also embodied in this same way. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And this was what I was saying. I said, like, I don't think the P's have an order, because you have some people, depending on your mode of learning or constraints, like you're going to come at it better, sometimes procedurally, sometimes prepositionally, sometimes like language versus sound, right? Or sound versus hearing. Sorry, sound versus sight. Right? You can kind of, I think they're all, you eventually get there. I also see a lot of this kind of as like forms of like play. I mean, like in a sense of, right, that you try out something. Vervaeke talks about this, but he's not, it predates him quite a bit. Right, that you try out something, kids pretend to be whatever, a fireman, or an animal or whatever. They're trying to like grasp what it's like to be that thing. So they act it out based on what they know about it, but they have to actually like physically like act it out, right? And then they kind of like start to try to take on that perspective. They try to like, what's it like to be a cow or whatever, I don't know. Yeah. Or like even in acting, right? So people, like what it's like to be this, completely other person, just in order to then be able to like embody that, or convey the emotion, expression, whatever it would be. And that's kind of how we play with like perspectives and like, but you use the procedure to get the perspectival, and then eventually kind of maybe you can articulate it into words and make it propositional or whatever, right? But like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of like whatever. That's kind of, at least some people would argue that's kind of what ritual does, right? The whole point of ritual is to kind of like have you play out these sequences, whether it's like prayer, synagogue, or mass, or whatever, like.
Which is interesting, because I mean, you've brought up this. This sounds totally backwards. So you've brought up Christianity a few times.
Well, I do that as a way to translate.
Yeah, because you like translating things. Is that your dissertation in part, about working between languages and?
Well, in a very, very abstract sense, right? I'm doing human like robot trust. So like between languages in a very different way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there was a few spots where I read this and where I was looking back to some of the stuff from Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, and I can't remember. I'm going to have to go back, because I got into this argument. Well, it wasn't an argument, but it was a discussion with my ex-husband, and he was using meta as well and getting all bent out of shape about it for some reason that I didn't quite understand. But all of the stuff this week put me in mind of some of those arguments around Trinity, non-Trinity, and why on earth I found myself, to say thinking isn't even, it's that place where language is tactile. And I was picturing God stepping down into the, like contracting himself into the ark. And there was a spot where it was talking about something said in the female, not text. English doesn't help with this. Anyway, and I was picturing all of the things I've heard about, well, they say, because I'm thinking in Greek from the Protestant side, like Christ being born of a woman, and I'm thinking, geez, that's another image of God contracting himself. Like they're talking about, and because you go, well, how could Jesus be both God and man? And I'm like, I don't know how he could be both God and man. That makes no sense to me. And I'm a Christian. So, like I just basically, I'm living where I'm living in this space in between actually getting things and not getting things. But I'm going, well, whether I understand it or not, that's kind of a really interesting idea of all the ways that God gives us examples of how you embody something, how you put yourself into that which it's like language again, in a sense. To me, there's something that I still don't even get about my own background, let alone coming at things from the Jewish perspective of stuff. But it seems to be, so you're not hearing me, so you're not kind of seeing me, so you're not. And I'm like, there's something going on with God going, you guys are a little dense, but I love you. Let me just try and explain this to you. But it still comes down to will, because you can't love without will. And I'm like, oh my goodness, my poor brain's going to be doing backflips for about a week, 2 weeks, whenever we meet again. Oh, look at your cat. Oh, I like cats.
You also have to understand that Soloveitchik, I don't know, I haven't heard the other parts of your conversation, but like, and I don't know what Jacob kind of filled you in on, but he's like famous for being like very Maimonidean, more than like almost any, like his family especially, and he's gonna always kind of.
So we can expect to hear about this.
Yeah, I mean, you would expect this. He's very, I mean, he's a great guy who he wrote a lot of great work. But some of like the really deep insights, I would say, from the Jewish side, for people who like, let's say, other rabbis who like knew these concepts and texts and stuff, where his real insights were like solving seeming contradictions in Maimonides. He had just a really so he talks about this. Is actually interesting because as he's a little more participatory than Maimonides is, I would say. But one of the things he talks about, especially and more playful, so like he'll talk about like he basically was taught by his grandfather, which is not typical in the sense of like he didn't learn in a big yeshiva. He didn't learn with people of his own age. He was taught by his father and grandfather, and he was pretty isolated as a child for various reasons. But that led him to basically, like he says, when he learned Jewish texts, like he would literally feel like they were sitting in front of him, like he could picture them in front of him, like the different people, like let's say on a page of Talmud, and like having a conversation. And he was like really having a conversation with them. He knew like them well. He knew people's perspectives well enough to like kind of have personalities and identities tied for each person. These weren't just like disembodied statements, which is like not super common. Unlike, let's say, when you learn a church father and you read, like you can read Augustine's Confessions or whatever it is, and you kind of can get like a book written by the person that's kind of biographical, or at least you have like one book written by one person. Whereas like for a lot of these guys, like they're read as like they're already in dialogues and you're reading their dialogues and you're trying to follow along like 7 or 8 people talking over thousands of pages, and like I remember hundreds of people talking over thousands of pages, but like on every couple of pages will be like the same, handful of people. Like trying to come up with like a composite personality or figure out like who they are coherently is really hard. He did that for a lot of these guys, and Maimonides is probably best of all. Like he could embody, like he understood perspectively what it was like to be Maimonides and think like Maimonides. So like for him, he experiences this in a different way, but like, yeah, it's not surprising that's the view he's going to bring, even when he's not going to cite it explicitly half the time. It's always the person in the back of his mind when he's writing this stuff. Not to say he doesn't know a lot of other sources, but like that's where he's often coming from. Just like often makes him seem a lot more important, because like in these books he's like the big Jewish figure in all these books. Whereas it's very different. It's also different because like if you look at Chabad, like Chabad loves Maimonides, but they don't study the same parts that Soloveitchik studied. Like, that's not. They all study like the commandments part. Like, so Maimonides has a law code, right? The Mishnah Torah. They all study the law code. But Chabad only studies the law code, basically, though. And like Soloveitchik was interested in the philosophy, like in like the Guide for the Perplexed and the other philosophical works by Maimonides, and how they have bearing on the law code, and how and sometimes their intention. I mean, the laws are for everyone, and the philosophical text is for the philosophers. So like, there's a big tension between them sometimes. But Soloveitchik, yeah, it's important to kind of understand that about him. Even if you never read Maimonides before, if you're seeing all of Judaism through Soloveitchik's lens, it's going to be much more Maimonidean than like, and philosophical then, and not necessarily super like insanely rational. But Maimonides certainly, let's say, is biased in that direction.
Yeah.
But he also, I can't remember. Soloveitchik got a PhD in philosophy, and his dissertation was on maybe Hermann Cohen, one of the 19th century Jewish philosophers who was like much more Kantian. So he also kind of has this other Western philosophy influence that's kind of making him a little more attuned to the Enlightenment. I was neither here nor there, but I think it's useful information for going through the book. I don't know when I'll join you again, but this is fun. Yeah, good conversation.
Well, we definitely appreciate it. Is there anything else somebody wants to mention? We are getting kind of late, and I don't want to keep people too long, especially as East Coasters.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy, you're smiling. Do you have something else you want to say?
No, I just want to smile.
Okay. Ben, anything else you want to say?
No, I think we went through a lot of the stuff that also came up in my mind as I was reading this. It was definitely useful to hear from you, Yosef, as well. Appreciate
Thanks for having me. Hopefully I didn't talk too much over your normal
No, it's good. It's good. It's nice because it's kind of ironic. I said in the beginning that in this section that we read, it's mainly in dialogue with kind of Chabad Hasidim. In some sense, a lot of the notes are surrounding Luki Tai Amarim or something like that.
Lukatei Maharan.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny that Jacob wasn't here, considering that he's a Chabad boy. But I think it's good that you kind of brought this perspective of Maimonides and how it fits in. And I also see some of it from reading Chacham Fa'ur, who also is very Maimonidean. So
yes, he is. In a somewhat different way, but yeah.
Yeah, well, for example, I don't know, in one of the books I read, he says that like something about with will, like only now in this world where like you can choose to be religious or not, can you truly be religious, So that seems to be very much reflective of what you were kind of talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's a major theme in the Talmudic analysis of Purim, actually. That they were at Sinai, they were kind of coerced. They kind of like, what are they going to do? They're in the desert. They have to, like, of course, they're going to have to. They trust in God or they die, right? Where the Talmud describes it, Sinai was literally hanging over their heads. You know, if they didn't accept it, like they felt like, you know, that was the end. Whereas like at Purim, the temple was destroyed. They were in a foreign land. They could have chosen. You know, it was an act of will, and in some ways, that's very much, you know, the situation of being in exile, like kind of is also an act of maturation. I mean, this is more of a Hasidic idea, but or Kabbalistic, maybe more generally, right? You know, one of the many things that God had to do, and it was retract himself, his will, so we could have free will, retract his presence, so, you know, we could have, let's say, faith, retract his, you know, so one of the retractions, and, you know, and we may not like to hear it, was being in exile, because it gives us a freedom. You know, it really, let's say, tests our mettle at a different level.
That's one of the things. Did we talk? Is it in the book itself or the notes from the book where it talks about, or was it somewhere else that I read because I was reading this about God is in 10 different steps, and then God sent 7 righteous people into the world, and that, you know, that kind of well, you know, that the contraction is not, we think of contraction as being unidirectional, but the word doesn't always mean that. It can mean like the in and out, like our eye does, you know, as we're seeing things, and our eye is taking into account the surroundings in which you're seeing things.
Jacob and I kind of, I feel like I talk about something similar in the Torah studies. We talk about descent for the sake of ascent, and I feel like that's connected. Of like, here the Rav talks about like the generations of like, there's a descent through the generation, and then there's an ascent through the generations, and there's a lot to talk about.
That phrase is used for Egypt, right? So they had to descend to experience slavery in order to kind of like get those lessons and ascend.
Right, and then you're at the higher level where you were before. So it's like, it goes through the descent from the tree, the garden, the Exodus, and then where we are now until the Messiah. So he talks about all, like, I mean, that definitely.
Well, I mean, I was gonna say, like, this is, the Christians certainly are aware of this. They would call this death for the sake of resurrection. You need to die to yourself, or etc. Or the U-shaped journey, I guess, if you're going to be like that, whatever.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, right? But it also has a parallel in Kabbalistic thought, right, where there's ascent for the sake of descent, right? That you kind of have the mystical journey and, like, you know, achieve whatever, you know, union with God, or the God, you know, not God, but whatever they do in kind of the in the meditative Kabbalistic, you know, mystical experience, and then, but the whole point is to come back down and then, like, integrate that into your life, right? So there's kind of like, it flips it on its head, that we kind of have these, you know, depending on which perspective you're taking, is it ascent or descent, and, you know, which way and why. And God does this journey, and man does this journey. History does this journey, right? So it's like all the levels, fractally, or I recursively, depend, kind of applying it.
So, I'm going to lose the word I was going to use. When I never heard the word embodied used in the way it is until I kind of started hearing it in this, well, as they say, in this little corner kind of deal. But it's interesting when you talk about the U-shape, like from both directions, the ascent and the descent. And my mind keeps going back to how little we've touched on some of the some of the things where I was like, oh, that's so weird. They're in, Song of Songs, and the Song of Songs is teaching us about the garden and about Genesis, and it's talking about the beginning of things, and all the way through you're talking about the 4 Ps and everything. And sometimes somewhere you said, Joseph, and sometimes a 5th, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, like the 5 senses, because every sense is a language in a way. Then I was going to say every sense is a language in a sense. Yeah, that's it's near midnight. But all of this that we're talking about is just like this much of what this section is getting into on all of these things, and it feels huge.
Mm-hmm.
We've barely talked about it, and that's amazing, because that reminds me of the ascent and the descent and the God asks us to build the temple and make this whole thing participatory, because you cannot love without will. If there is no will, there is no love. And I'm like, oh, wow.
Okay. Well, I'll close on one quick thing. So the sequel to this book that I mentioned earlier is entirely framed within the Song of Songs. And I mean, I know he mentions it quite a bit in this book, but he then even expanded further in the sequel, where it becomes like the main like running theme. And instead of calling it Ascent Descent, he's going to call it like a game of hide and seek, basically, with God. As we think we're approaching, we hear, he's at the door, knocking. We open the door and he's not there. And then we like look for him in the city. I mean, the whole Song of Songs like narrative, right? The plot line of like searching for the lost love that we're once aware of, or kind of at the edge of your vision, or at the edge of your memory, that you kind of keep chasing, and like you think you're about to grasp and then like just miss. Yeah, that's going to be a major thing. So that's more of a horizontal version, I guess, of the ascent descent ideas. But yeah, that it's like what you're saying with contraction, that it goes back and forth. It's not just one direction, unidirectional.
No, but that's what you said earlier about playfulness. God is incredibly relational, and we are like little children trying to learn to be. Wow. I gotta get that book too.
Yeah, it was. I don't know if it's still on, but like for some reason it was like $3 on Amazon a couple months ago, so I picked up a copy, which was like, there's no reason. I don't know why they cut it down so much, but it was like, for that, I might as well buy my own copy. I don't know if it's still on a ridiculous sale or not, but I know a lot of people that read it recently because it's so available. I don't think it's on archive. It was I don't think it got published so much more recently, which was, it might even be posthumous when it finally came out. Yeah, or it might have been out in Hebrew, but I don't think it came out in English, at least, until more recently. So. But yeah, these are tips of the iceberg. There's so much more to talk about. I don't know if y'all ever get to the sequel.
All right, well, that's probably good. We've enticed Yosef, so maybe in the next couple of weeks he will come around and join us.
Yeah.
Again. So I'm suggesting for our next reading, we're going to read page 63 to 78. That will be 2 chapters or so. Actually, 3. Chapters 10 through 12. And then we will convene again in 2 weeks on the 16th of March.
Sounds good. 63 to 78.
Yep.
Yeah, 63 to 78.
Sounds good.
All right, guys. It was good talking with you. Again, thank you to Ben for hosting it this time in lieu of Jacob. Thank you, Yosef, for coming on and explaining everything to us. Thank you, Sandy, for being here. Thank you, chat. Even though you were a little bit quiet, we appreciate you coming and watching us. Have a good night, guys.
Have a good night.
Have a good Purim, man.
You too.
Good.
Sameh.